The Forbidden World, a tale of the time before. Do you truly know the history of humanity? Before the great waters rose and swept away everything that was, there existed a world so strange and unbelievable that it challenges reason itself. Giants walked among us, forbidden secrets whispered in the shadows, and the entire earth seemed to conspire to hide mysteries that still elude us today. What was kept in silence? Who dared to challenge the heavens? Journey through this lost world, if you have the courage. But be warned. The impossible may not be as impossible as you imagine. In the time before time was counted in the way we know it now, when the earth was young and the boundary between heaven and earth was thin as morning mist, there lived a woman named Alara in the city of Enoch. She was 23 years old, with eyes that held the depth of ancient wisdom despite her youth. The city stretched endlessly before her, its crystalline towers reaching toward the heavens like fingers grasping for something just beyond their touch. The year was 1656 from the creation, though such numbers meant little to those who lived in that strange time. Days flowed like honey, thick and golden, and men lived for 900 years or more, their bodies untouched by the rapid decay that would later plague humanity. Alara's grandfather, Methuselah, had walked the earth for 872 years, and still his step was firm, his mind sharp as the day he was born. But something was wrong in this paradise. Alara felt it in her bones, a trembling that began deep within the earth and worked its way up through the foundations of their impossible city. The Nephilim, those towering beings born of the union between the sons of heaven and the daughters of men, had grown too bold, too numerous. They stood 15 feet tall, some even 20, their presence casting shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. She remembered the first time she had seen one of the Watchers. She was 7 years old, playing in the gardens of crystal, where flowers sang in harmonies that could heal broken hearts. The being had descended from the clouds, not walking, but moving as if the air itself carried him forward. His form was both terrible and beautiful, with 6 wings that caught and reflected light in ways that hurt to look upon directly. When he spoke, his voice was like the sound of 1,000 waters falling from great heights. "Child," the Watcher had said, his words resonating in frequencies that touched her soul rather than her ears. "The time of choosing draws near. Your kind stands at the edge of an abyss deeper than the foundations of the world." But that was 16 years ago, when the Watchers still maintained some pretense of benevolence. Now, in her 23rd year, Alara witnessed their true nature daily. They had taught humanity the forbidden arts, how to work metals that could cut through stone as if it were water, how to read the movements of stars and predict the future, how to craft weapons that could kill with a touch, and most dangerous of all, how to manipulate the very essence of life itself. The city of Enoch had become a monument to this forbidden knowledge. Its streets were paved with stones that glowed with their own inner light, carved from materials that did not exist on Earth before the Watchers brought them from their realm. Buildings defied the laws of nature, suspended in midair by forces that hummed with an energy that made the skin crawl. Gardens bloomed with fruits that granted visions of other worlds, and fountains flowed with waters that could restore youth to the aged or grant terrible longevity to those who drank deeply. In the great market square, Alara walked among the merchants who sold their impossible wares. There was old Samuel, 347 years of age, who crafted mirrors that showed not reflections, but the deepest desires of those who looked into them. His stall neighbored that of young Marcus, barely 80 years old, who bred animals that should not have existed, horses with wings that could carry riders to the edge of the firmament, serpents whose bite could grant the gift of tongues, and great cats whose purr could lull an entire city to sleep. The Nephilim giants moved through the crowds like ships through water, the smaller humans parting before them instinctively. Some carried instruments of music that could reshape stone with their melodies, while others bore scrolls covered in writing that shifted and changed even as one watched. Their children, the second generation of these hybrid beings, were even more terrible than their parents, possessing powers that seemed to mock the very order of creation. Alara's friend Judith, who had seen 29 summers, worked in the great library where the forbidden books were kept. She spoke in whispers of texts that described how to bind spirits to physical forms, how to cross the boundaries between worlds, how to speak with the dead and command them to return. The knowledge contained in those volumes was so dangerous that merely reading certain passages could drive a person mad or worse, transform them into something that was no longer human. "They're planning something," Judith had confided to Alara just 3 days before, her voice barely audible even in the empty corridors of the library. "The Council of Watchers meets at the dark of each moon. I've seen the preparations. Strange apparatus being constructed in the deep vaults beneath the city, machines that pulse with energies that make the air itself feel heavy and wrong." The apparatus Judith spoke of was indeed real, though few understood its true purpose. Deep beneath Enoch, in chambers carved from living rock, the Watchers had constructed a device of impossible complexity. It stood 50 feet tall and 30 feet wide, made from metals that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. Symbols covered every surface, not carved but somehow grown from the metal itself, writhing and changing in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. This machine, the Watchers called it the Gate of Sorrows, was designed to tear open the veil between worlds permanently. No longer would they need to descend from heaven to earth. They would bring their realm to this one, merging the two in a union that would remake reality itself. The consequences of such an act were beyond the understanding of most, but Alara had glimpsed enough in dreams and visions to know that it would mean the end of humanity, as God had created them. The dreams had begun when she was 19. In them, she walked through cities where the sky rained fire and the rivers ran with blood. She saw creatures that were parodies of life, created by the union of elements that should never touch. Men with the heads of beasts, beasts with the wisdom of men, and things that defied description crawling through landscapes that shifted like water. In the worst of these dreams, she stood before the great throne of heaven and heard the voice of the Almighty speaking words of judgment. The sound was like thunder, but also like weeping, carrying the weight of infinite sorrow for what his creation had become. "The wickedness of man is great upon the earth," the voice said, "and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is only evil continually. I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth." Alara would wake from these dreams with tears streaming down her face, knowing with terrible certainty that they were not mere products of sleep, but visions of what was to come. She tried to speak of them to others, but who would believe such a thing? Life in Enoch was good, prosperous, filled with wonders that made each day seem like a gift. Why would anyone want to hear prophecies of doom? Yet the signs were there for those with eyes to see. The weather had begun to change in the past year, patterns that had held steady for centuries now shifting in ways that made no sense. Rains fell when the skies were clear, while drought persisted, even when clouds gathered thick and dark. The very air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made animals restless and children cry for no reason. Animals were changing too. Alara had noticed it first in the birds. They flew in strange formations now, patterns that resembled the symbols she had seen in the forbidden books. Dogs howled at times when the moon was full, but their cries sounded almost like words, as if they were trying to speak warnings in tongues they did not possess. Even the insects seemed different, gathering in swarms that moved with purpose and intelligence that chilled the soul. The Nephilim giants had begun to exhibit new powers as well. Where once they had been content to rule through physical might and the forbidden knowledge taught by their fathers, now they displayed abilities that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. Alara had seen one of them, a giant named Azazel who stood 18 feet in height, pass his hand through solid stone as if it were air. Another, called Semjaza, could speak words that made plants grow and wither at his command, or cause the earth itself to tremble. Their human followers had grown increasingly bold as well. Cults had formed around the worship of the Watchers, groups of men and women who sought to become like their otherworldly masters. They practiced rituals that involved the sacrifice of animals, and some whispered of darker offerings still. Their ceremonies were held in groves outside the city, where ancient trees had been carved with symbols that predated human memory. Alara had witnessed one such gathering when she was 21, following her cousin Marcus, who had become involved with the cult of Azazel. Hidden behind a great oak whose trunk was wide enough to shelter a dozen people, she watched in horror as 200 men and women danced in circles around a fire that burned without fuel. Their bodies moved in ways that seemed to defy the structure of human joints, bending and twisting in configurations that should have been impossible. As the night deepened, the dancers began to change. Their skin took on a luminous quality, glowing with the same cold light that emanated from the watchers. Their eyes became like stars, burning with an inner fire that was beautiful and terrible to behold. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that made the air itself vibrate, and Alara felt something deep within her respond to the sound, as if part of her soul was being drawn toward the circle. It was then that she saw them, the shadows that moved between the dancers. They were not the shadows of the humans, but something else entirely, shapes that suggested forms beyond human comprehension. These shadows danced their own dance, sometimes merging with the human dancers, sometimes separating to move in patterns that seemed to trace symbols in the air itself. The ritual reached its climax when Azazel himself appeared among them. He did not descend from above as the Watchers usually did, but seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves, his massive form coalescing from darkness into terrible reality. When he spoke, his voice was like the sound of mountains breaking apart. "Children of the new flesh," he said, his words causing several of the dancers to fall to their knees in ecstasy or terror. "The time of transformation approaches. Soon, the boundaries between what is above and what is below will be dissolved, and you shall become as we are, eternal and powerful beyond mortal understanding." The dancers responded with cries of joy that sounded more animal than human, their transformed voices creating harmonies that made the very air seem to tear like fabric. Alara felt her own body responding to the sound, her heart racing and her vision beginning to blur at the edges. It was only by biting down hard on her tongue, using physical pain to anchor herself to her human nature, that she was able to resist the pull of the ceremony. She fled then, running through the dark forest as fast as her legs could carry her, the sound of inhuman singing following her like a tide. When she finally reached the safety of her home, she found her grandfather Methuselah waiting for her, his ancient eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass centuries. "You have seen them," he said, not asking but stating a fact. "The time grows short, child. The corruption spreads like a plague, and soon there will be nowhere left for those who remember what humanity was meant to be." Methuselah had lived through the early days of the Watchers' arrival. He had been there when they first descended, presenting themselves as teachers and benefactors. He had watched as humanity eagerly embraced their gifts, not understanding the true price that would be demanded. Now in his 900th year of life, he was one of the few who remembered what the world had been like before their influence began to transform everything. "There was a time," he told Alara as they sat by the fire that night, "when men were content to be men. We knew our place in creation, understood the boundaries that defined our existence. We were not angels, nor did we seek to become them. We were human, and that was enough. But that time was ending, if it had not ended already." Throughout the earth, the influence of the Watchers and their Nephilim offspring had spread like ripples on a pond, touching every aspect of human civilization. Cities rose overnight, their architecture incorporating principles that defied natural law. Technologies appeared that could harness the very forces of creation, but always at a cost that few understood until it was too late. In the great city of Babel, which lay 700 miles to the east of Enoch, the rulers had begun construction of a tower that they claimed would reach to heaven itself. The structure grew day by day, its height already surpassing any mountain on earth, built from stones that had been transformed by Watcher knowledge into materials stronger than diamond, yet lighter than air. The workers who labored on the tower spoke of hearing voices in the wind, instructions that came not from their human overseers, but from sources that seemed to exist beyond the physical world. Similar projects were underway in cities across the earth. In the coastal city of Tyre, builders worked on ships that could sail not just on water, but through the air itself, their hulls carved from woods that grew in the realm of the Watchers. In the mountain stronghold of Hermon, vast underground complexes were being excavated, chambers designed to house the most dangerous of the forbidden artifacts and experiments. The human cost of these endeavors was enormous, though few spoke of it openly. Workers died in numbers that would have been shocking in earlier times, but death itself had become strange in the age of the Watchers. Some of the dead did not remain dead, their bodies animated by forces that transformed them into servants of those who had killed them. Others simply vanished, their fate unknown, but suspected to involve transformations too horrible for the living to contemplate. Children were being born with abnormalities that increased with each generation. Some were born with extra limbs or organs that served no apparent purpose. Others possessed abilities that no human should have. The power to see through solid objects, to hear conversations from vast distances, or to influence the thoughts and emotions of those around them. These children were revered by some as the next step in human evolution, but others recognized them as signs of corruption spreading through the very essence of humanity. Alara herself had begun to manifest strange abilities in recent months. She could sometimes sense the emotions of others as if they were her own, and on several occasions had experienced vivid dreams that later proved to be accurate visions of future events. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to see the true forms of the Watchers, not the beautiful appearances they chose to wear, but the alien entities they actually were. In these visions, the Watchers appeared as beings of geometric impossibility, their forms constructed from angles that should not exist in three-dimensional space. They moved through dimensions that human senses could not fully perceive, their presence causing reality itself to bend and warp around them. When they spoke, their words carried layers of meaning that human minds were not equipped to process, concepts that could drive a person insane simply by being understood. The most terrible revelation was that the Watchers were not acting alone. Behind them stood entities of even greater power and malevolence, beings that existed in realms so removed from human understanding that they could only be perceived as vast shadows cast across reality. These entities sought not merely to rule over humanity, but to remake the entire created order according to their own incomprehensible designs. As the months passed, signs of the approaching catastrophe became impossible to ignore. Earthquakes struck with increasing frequency, not the natural tremors caused by shifting rock, but deliberate manipulations of the Earth's structure by forces that sought to prepare the ground for what was coming. The sea itself began to behave strangely, tides that followed no lunar pattern, and currents that carried objects from unknown lands. Stars fell from the heavens in numbers that should have been impossible, each one trailing fire that burned with colors that had no names. When these celestial visitors struck the Earth, they did not create craters as falling rocks should, but instead opened doorways from which emerged creatures that belonged to no earthly taxonomy. These beings, part flesh and part shadow, began to spread across the land, infiltrating human settlements and spreading their influence like a contagion. The weather became increasingly violent and unpredictable. Storms arose that combined elements in ways that defied natural law. Rain that fell upward, snow that burned like fire, and winds that carried voices speaking in tongues that predated human language. Lightning struck in patterns that resembled the forbidden symbols, and thunder spoke words that only the most sensitive could understand, prophecies of transformation and judgment. In the city of Enoch, the authorities tried to maintain order as panic began to spread among the population. The Council of Elders, many of whom were themselves enthralled to the Watchers, issued proclamations that the strange events were merely signs of a new age of enlightenment dawning for humanity. They spoke of evolution, of transcendence, of the breaking down of barriers that had long prevented humans from achieving their true potential. But Alara and others like her could see through these lies. The changes were not evolution, but corruption, not transcendence, but the systematic destruction of everything that made humans human. The barriers being broken were not limitations, but protections, boundaries established by divine wisdom to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe that was now unfolding.
The final catalyst came on a night when the moon refused to rise and the stars arranged themselves in patterns that spelled out warnings in scripts that burned themselves into the minds of those who looked upon them. In the deep vaults beneath Enoch, the Gate of Sorrows was finally activated, its alien machinery drawing power from sources that existed beyond the physical universe. The activation sent shockwaves through reality itself. Animals fled in every direction, driven by instincts that recognized the approach of something fundamentally wrong. Plants withered and died in patterns that spread outward from the city like ripples of death. The very air became thick and oppressive, charged with energies that made it difficult to breathe. Ilara felt the change in her bones, a resonance that spoke of barriers being torn down and boundaries being violated. She looked up at the sky and saw it beginning to tear like fabric, revealing glimpses of other realms beyond. Through these tears she could see the true domain of the Watchers, a place of impossible geometries and beings of pure malevolence. It was then that she heard the voice, not speaking to her ears but directly to her soul. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams, the voice of the Creator himself, filled with sorrow and righteous anger at what his creation had become. "The end of all flesh is come before me," the voice said, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. "For the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." But with the judgment came also mercy, for the voice continued, "Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch." Ilara understood then that she was witnessing the final moments of the antediluvian world, the last breaths of an age that had pushed the boundaries of creation too far, and must now face the consequences. She thought of Noah, the righteous man who even now was beginning his great work of construction, and she knew that through him and his family, something of the original human nature would survive the coming deluge. The gate of sorrows reached full power at the moment of dawn, sending a pulse of energy through the earth that was felt in every corner of creation. The sky split open completely, revealing the realm of the Watchers in all its terrible glory. Beings of indescribable horror began to pour through the opening, their forms causing reality to buckle and bend around them. But even as the forces of corruption achieved their moment of triumph, the judgment of heaven was already in motion. Waters began to pour from sources that had been sealed since the foundation of the world, springs deep within the earth opening to disgorge torrents that would soon cover the highest mountains. The windows of heaven opened as well, releasing rains that fell not as droplets but as solid walls of water. The Nephilim giants tried to use their powers to stem the flood, their voices raised in harmonies that had once commanded the elements. But the waters were beyond their influence, carrying with them the authority of creation itself. One by one, the impossible cities began to crumble as their foundations were swept away. The crystalline towers of Enoch toppled into the rising waters, their alien materials dissolving as if they had never been real at all. Ilara found herself swept along by the flood, not to destruction but to a strange kind of salvation. As the waters rose around her, she felt herself changing, not in the corrupt way of those who had embraced Watcher knowledge, but in a manner that seemed to prepare her for whatever lay beyond this ending. Her last sight of the antediluvian world was of the Watchers themselves being drawn back through their dimensional gates. Their rebellion ended not by defeat in battle, but by the simple expedient of removing the stage upon which they had performed their cosmic drama.
The hidden truth about Noah's flood. From the Bible. What if everything you thought you knew about Noah's flood was only the beginning of a much deeper, more terrifying truth? The warning signs were there all along. For 120 years, Noah hammered. Day after day, the sound of his tools echoed across the ancient landscape like a death knell that no one understood. The people of his generation, brilliant, advanced, powerful, laughed at the old man building his massive vessel on dry ground, miles from any sea. But Noah wasn't just building a boat. He was constructing humanity's only escape pod from the greatest catastrophe the world had ever known. The biblical account tells us something chilling. God looked down at his creation and saw that every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. This wasn't about a few bad people making poor choices. This was about an entire civilization so corrupted, so twisted in its thinking, that divine intervention became the only solution. The real timeline. More terrifying than you think. Here's what most people don't realize about the timeline. Noah didn't just wake up one morning and start building. Genesis tells us he was 600 years old when the flood came. But the warning came much earlier. For over a century, this man devoted his entire life to preparing for something that had never happened before in human history. Think about that. For 120 years, Noah lived with the knowledge that everyone around him, his neighbors, his community, perhaps even extended family, was going to die. Every conversation, every interaction, every day was shadowed by this terrible secret that God had revealed to him. The people of Noah's time weren't primitive cave dwellers. The Bible suggests they were advanced, perhaps even more sophisticated than we imagine. They had developed agriculture, built cities, created music and metalwork. Genesis mentions that they were mighty men of renown. These weren't ignorant people. They were intelligent enough to recognize that Noah's project made no rational sense, yet they couldn't see what was coming. The Nephilim factor, the untold horror. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing, and where many modern interpretations have sanitized the biblical account. Genesis 6 mentions something that most Sunday school lessons skip over entirely. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. This isn't folklore or mythology buried in the text. This is biblical history, describing something so abnormal, so contrary to God's design, that it contributed to the decision to wipe the slate clean. The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from Nephil, meaning to fall. These were the fallen ones, beings that represented a corruption so fundamental that it threatened the very genetic integrity of humanity itself. The text suggests that supernatural beings had interfered with human bloodlines, creating hybrid offspring that were mighty men of renown. This wasn't just moral corruption. This was biological contamination on a scale that threatened to make humanity unredeemable. The 8 souls. Why these specific people? When God looked across the entire earth, he found exactly 8 people worth saving. Not 800, not 80. 8. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. Out of what could have been millions of people spread across the ancient world, only these 8 individuals maintained the genetic and spiritual purity necessary to restart the human race. The Bible says Noah was righteous in his generation and walked with God, but it also says he was perfect, and the Hebrew word used here, tamim, doesn't just mean morally perfect. It means complete, whole, without blemish. In the context of widespread genetic contamination, Noah's family may have been the only humans left who were still completely human. The 40 days and 40 nights, nature turned upside down. When the flood finally came, it wasn't just rain. The Bible describes something far more catastrophic. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. This suggests a geological upheaval beyond anything in recorded history. The fountains of the great deep implies massive underground water reserves, perhaps entire subterranean oceans, erupting to the surface. Combined with unprecedented rainfall, this would have created conditions that make our worst natural disasters look like minor inconveniences. For 40 days and 40 nights, this continued. But the water didn't recede immediately. The Bible tells us the water prevailed on the earth for 150 days. That's approximately 5 months of total global inundation, with water levels so high that even the highest mountains were covered by more than 20 feet of water.
you.